Do you have a table saw with a miter gauge and a fence? If so, then you can build this floating key organizer wall cabinet, and I'm going to show you how to build it every step of the way. Let's get started.
This cabinet is constructed completely with dado and rabbet joinery with no nails or screws. This is the same fundamental joinery used in most cabinets out there, so if you can build this, you can scale this up to build just about any kind of cabinet. For example, my built-in router table cabinet is basically the same thing as this key organizer, but bigger. By the way, I published a full build article in Popular Science for this cabinet, so if you're planning to build this yourself, check out that article for all the exact dimensions I used. I'll include a link in the description below. To build this cabinet, you'll need 7 feet of 1x6 lumber, a small piece of 1/4-inch plywood for the back panel, and some screw hooks for the bottom. I used oak lumber here and stained it darker to match the color of the front door of my house. To avoid having to use a jointer and a planer, take your time picking out the straightest boards you can find when you buy the lumber. Start by screwing a flat piece of wood to your miter gauge to extend its reach. Use the miter gauge to make a clean cut on one end of the 1x6 board, and if you have some sort of square measuring tool, check to make sure that the cut is right at 90 degrees. If the cut is out of square, adjust your miter gauge now to dial in the perfect cut. With your gauge calibrated, cut out the 3 horizontal boards, which are 13 1/4 inches each. The exact length doesn't matter, but it's critical that all 3 are exactly the same length. Use the first board to mark the length of the next 2, and be sure to cut on the far side of the pencil line, not right down the middle. Next, cut out the 2 vertical pieces, which are 6 inches each. Again, the actual length doesn't matter, but these 2 need to match exactly. Now would be a good time to cut out the overhanging top piece of the cabinet, which is 16 inches long. Full disclosure, I forgot about it and cut it out later in this video. Now ditch the miter gauge and use the table saw fence to rip the 13 1/4 inch boards and the 2 6-inch boards from 5.5 inches wide down to 4.5 inches wide. If you've already cut out the 16-inch overhanging top piece, make sure not to rip it any narrower. You'll want it to stay the full 5.5 inch wide. Stand your cabinet up on a flat surface and mark where the top and bottom horizontal pieces will fit into one of the vertical pieces. Decide now where you want the middle shelf to be and mark that as well. I chose to make it slightly higher than the center point for no real reason. Sandwich the marked vertical side against the other vertical side and transfer the marks over from one half to the other. This way you can be sure that the horizontal center shelf will be level without having to actually measure anything. Next, cut out each notch, which is technically called a rabbet if it's on the edge of the board, or a dado if it's somewhere in the middle. First, lower your table saw blade to about half the thickness of the board. Exact height doesn't matter here, but once you lower the blade, lock it in place so it doesn't change height while you're cutting out the notches. Cut out each notch by taking multiple passes with your miter gauge. Start by cutting the notches a little too narrow and test to see if the horizontal board will fit in the slot. Slowly widen the notch until you get a snug fit. You could speed this process up with a wider dado stack blade, but it doesn't take long to just take several passes with a normal width blade. Also, I personally prefer to use my homemade crosscut sled for this kind of a cut, but I'm using the miter gauge here to limit the specialty tools required for this build. With all the dados cut, rip one of the 13 1/4 inch boards down to 3.5 inches wide. This piece is the middle shelf, which has to be an inch narrower because it will sit flush against a plywood panel inset 1 inch from the back of the cabinet. Next, cut a 1/4 inch wide groove along the inside perimeter of the cabinet, inset 1 inch from the back. This will hold the plywood back panel. After lowering the blade a little further than it was for the dados, set your table saw fence to be about 3/4 of an inch from the blade, and take one pass along the inside of each of the 4 outer walls of the cabinet. Now, lightly tap the fence to be a little further from the blade and take another pass on each of the 4 boards to widen the groove. Repeat this process until the groove is just wide enough for the edge of the plywood to fit in. The next step is cutting out the plywood back panel. Dry assemble the cabinet and measure to see how big the back panel should be. The panel should be big enough to fit within the groove, but not so big that it prevents the corner joints from fitting together. To avoid wasting plywood, I used a jigsaw to roughly cut out one square from a bigger piece, which I then cleaned up on the table saw. But you could just use the rip vents and the miter gauge on your table saw if you don't have a jigsaw. It doesn't have to be an exact fit, it just needs to be big enough to be trapped within the groove when the cabinet is glued up. My panel was 12 3/4 inches by 4 3/4 inches. At this point, everything is cut out and it's time to glue the cabinet together. You could do this glue up with as few as 2 F-style clamps, but for glue ups like this, I really recommend buying a strap clamp. It's the only non-standard clamp that I own, and I use it all of the time. While adjusting the clamps, check to make sure everything is nice and square. The plywood back panel will prevent things from getting too misaligned, though. Be sure to clean up any glue that squeezes out because it will be highly visible if you end up staining or applying finish to the cabinet. While the glue dries for at least half an hour, cut out the French cleat. A French cleat is made of 2 pieces of wood that fit together at a 45-degree angle. One piece gets glued to the back of the cabinet and the other gets screwed into a wall. That way, the cabinet can just be lifted on and off the wall, and it appears to float as the connection to the wall is hidden behind the back panel. I made my cleat out of some extra oak from this build, but since it's completely hidden, you can make it out of any wood you like. I made my cleat by ripping a 3-inch by 10-inch piece down the middle at a 45-degree angle. Glue one half of the cleat onto the top of the plywood back panel, using some heavy things to hold the piece down while the glue dries. Pre-drill some holes on the other half of the cleat to prepare it to be screwed onto a wall. Oh right, if you forgot to cut out the 16-inch overhanging top piece earlier like I did, now's a good time to cut that out. Now is also a good time to do some rough sanding if you want. This is an optional step, but in general it's good to at least smooth over the edges with some 150 grit sandpaper to avoid splinters and to make the cabinet more comfortable to touch. The last step is to glue on the overhanging top panel using either heavy things to hold it down or some clamps. Make sure the back of the panel is flush with the back of the cabinet so that the entire back of the cabinet will hang flush with the wall. I chose to stain my cabinet with Minwax Espresso finish, then I did a final seal coat with some spray-on lacquer. It's up to you how to stain and finish your cabinet, but if your joints came out worse than you had hoped, you can always paint over them. The last step is to install 3 evenly spaced screw hooks on the underside of the cabinet. Make sure to pre-drill the holes for them with a big enough drill bit, otherwise the wood might split or the hook might break. I learned that lesson the hard way.
Oh no, 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 no! Yikes. Did you just break off, you
And there you have it. You've built a solid cabinet that will last 100 years, and you've learned the skills to build any cabinets of any size using only a table saw. Thanks for watching.